Thanks, Kentan. Can't wait to present. So next up is Karangelos, who will talk about hierarchical balancing, which is grid aware.
So I use the, well, how does this work? Can I use this to change my slide?
You can use let them set it up, and then you can use the arrows on the computer to move the slides and the pointer to point.
Okay, then I will try this also. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here with us today. It is my pleasure to be with you to present the joint work that I have done over the past year and a half now with Anthony on grid-aware flexibility aggregation for zonal balancing markets. And now I cannot change the slide for some reason. Okay, now I can, I think, yes. Perfect. Okay, so if you want to find out more about our work, I am very happy to say that this is already, let's say, accepted for publication in the special issue of the Electric Power Systems Journal, which comes out of the PSCC conference proceedings. I was, in fact, last week in Paris, where I saw Panos to present this work and collected some very interesting feedback. If you wish to have, let's say, the preprint of the paper already, I would be very happy to share with you and, of course, discuss more details, both online and offline. Now, the motivation from this work comes from the cross-border integration for electricity balancing in Europe. We know that more and more with the increase of renewables and the general increase in uncertainty in the European power system, there is a need to exchange reserves and to exchange balancing resources between the European countries. And of course, we know more and more that this poses several challenges that already many times today we have discussed. And one main reason for these challenges, let's say, at least as identified in this room, is the way that the grid is represented in the zonal balancing market clearing. So in the zonal balancing market clearing, in the European style zonal balancing market, as you guess, the grid is represented at the zonal resolution. So this means that we aggregate several nodes of the transmission grid into a few market zones, and crucially, a few market zones that may coexist in the same control area. Of course, when we clear a market at the zonal resolution, as Dr. Alex explained very well today, we face the risk of facing congestion when we come to disaggregate and when we come to actually deliver the power that we have promised to deliver. And importantly, we may face congestion inside a given market zone, which we have not explicitly represented, but also due to other factors, such as, for example, the possible use of the ATC simplification of the transport flow and the power flow. We may also face intra-area congestion between two market zones that belong in the same control area. Of course, this is a problem that TSOs have to deal with in the real operation of the system, and the available tools to manage this intra-area congestion so far are so-called ex-ante bit filtering and ex-ante bit blocking. So basically, there are two complementary tools. One is that the TSOs can, let's say, pre-scan the bits before these are forwarded to the zonal balancing market to identify if there are some bits that, if activated by the zonal balancing market, may cause intra-area congestion. And if this is the case, they may already filter these bits, and rather than forwarding them to the zonal balancing market, set them aside for the reason that they risk the security of the grid. Now, of course, this is an ex-ante idea, and many things that are anticipated don't happen in real life. And what may happen in real life is that after the clearing of the zonal balancing market, a bit may be activated that still causes intra-area congestion. And in that case, the TSO can block the bit of concern and has to replace it and activate another bit for balancing power in the same area. Now, how to do this is not really trivial, especially in the case of ex-ante bit filtering. There are many methodological questions on what would be the proper tools that we could use to select which bits we should filter in advance rather than give them to the balancing market, for the reason that they pose a risk for the intra-area security. Of course, apart from the methodological question, another issue that I would like to raise here is that if we let the TSO filter the bits before forwarding them to the market, then essentially we hide the intrazonal grid constraints from the market and we don't show the price of these. We also hide the TSO risk aversion from the market because a super conservative TSO may wish to filter, let's say, excessively bits inside its zone, and this is a price that all of us pay when we eventually see which bits are available in the market. Our work here is inspired by an alternative approach that has been put forward since several years by Anthony and some of the colleagues. I think Nikolai is involved in some of this work that is here today with us, and possibly Dimitris, I think, is involved in some of the papers. And the idea, rather than filtering the bids ahead of the market, try to aggregate the intrazonal resources in a price quantity curve. So the main proposal is to try to build a curve here, like the one that I saw here, that for each change in the net position of a zone attaches a marginal cost. But here, the cost that we wish to attach is not only the cost of the intrazonal resources that we would activate if we were to deliver this change in the net position of the zone, but also the cost of managing the grid congestion. So if you have an overall, let's say, view of the grid and the resources within a zone, you can try to build such a curve to represent both the cost of intrazonal resources and the cost of intrazonal congestion management. And you aggregate the complete set of bids of a zone in such a curve, and if you offer such curve in the market, then you are guaranteed that the market should give you enough money to both activate your resources as well as solve the intrazonal congestion. And once you have done that, once you have submitted a curve of this style to the market, you get a net position instruction for a complete zone, and then you are free to dispatch and settle the intrazonal resources inside the zone in any way that you wish to do so. Of course, you may wonder, if you're not familiar with the previous work, how to compute such a curve. And the main idea is to compute such a curve iteratively, meaning that given any net position change, we try to minimize the intra-area cost of delivering this net position change in advance and subject to the grid constraints. And if we do the same computation, try to minimize the intra-area cost subject to grid constraints over this, let's say, volume range of net positions, we can indeed iteratively construct the price quantity curve. And once we have indeed constructed this curve, it's straightforward to submit this in the zonal market in the place of the normal bids. So the main context, the main idea here is that we iteratively compute the intra-area cost subject to grid constraints over a range of export and import volumes. And we call this the aggregation-disaggregation approach, which relies on building the function that I have just explained, which is also called residual supply function. And of course, we approximate this ex ante. Now, in this work, I will revise a little bit this concept and try to revamp it a little bit. And you may wonder why, since this is indeed a very good idea to start with. Well, the reason why we decided to revisit this idea in this work that I will now present is the fact that this incremental export cost curve depends on many factors that are both uncertain and, of course, unobservable from the perspective of a single TSO. Now, the congestion that we may face inside a single area of the multi-area mesh transmission grid depends on the realization of imbalances all over the multi-area grid because, of course, the grid is connected. It also depends on the activation of balancing bids in external control areas, so not only in the area that we care about, but of course the market will activate balancing bids in the other control areas. This will in turn result in a change in the power flows and so on. And of course it depends on the detailed topologies of the external control areas, which are not under the control of the TSO that is making the aggregation. But of course, if you have topological changes outside the area of interest, this will in turn affect power flows. In the original works of Anthony and the colleagues, this was represented by a single best guess, which was according to the latest available information, and this indeed gives a good basis for computing the residual supply function. But unfortunately, it comes with a risk, and the risk is that when you come to disaggregate, so when the market has paid you some money and asks you to deliver a balancing volume, the cost that you have to face because of the change in these aforementioned factors would be greater than the cost that you have approximated as per the RSF. And for simplicity, I will try to refer to this risk in the continuation of my presentation as a disaggregation risk. Now that I have hopefully explained to you that there is indeed valid reason to revisit this proposal, I would like to explain to you how we have revisited this in the continuation of our work. The central concept in our, let's say, changed viewpoint of the problem of aggregating the intrazonal resources is the so-called changes in the boundary injections. Very simply, if we focus in a single control area, which is the area that we care about, we can recognize that after the clearing of the balancing market, we will have a new net position that we have to deliver, and this will be coordinated with the new net position of the other control areas. But in effect, what we will see is that we will see a change in the boundary injections, meaning the power flows that we exchange with the other control areas. And these are indeed very relevant and very meaningful for us, because if we knew both the export volume that we have to deliver, and if we also knew in advance how the boundary injections will change, then we could indeed recompute, let's say, with perfect accuracy the power flow inside our control area, because the boundary injection changes and the activations inside our control area, they translate into the intra-area power flows. And also, if we had, let's say, this model, apart from solving power flows for a given, let's say, activation inside the network, then we could indeed also solve, let's say, the same minimum cost of exporting the considered volume, but having, let's say, perfect information of how the external control areas will affect power flows inside our area. So what we thought, since these are, let's say, since these carry a lot of information, is to try to use these boundary injection changes and the topology of our own network as a proxy of the external balancing demand. Now, of course, the problem is that we don't know these boundary injection changes in advance because, as I explained, these depend on all the uncertain and unobservable factors that rely on the external grid. But what we thought here to try to do is to compute a worst-case approximation of the residual supply function by relying on a range of possible boundary injection changes that can be induced by the balancing market. So here we repeat again the same idea of iteratively computing the curve, but rather than solving for one single guess of how the external system would look like, we construct a range of boundary injection changes, and we solve a problem of trying to find the upper bound of the intra-area minimum export cost for any volume in this range. Now we will again construct a price quantity curve, but you may be already wondering, why do we propose to do this for an upper bound rather than the minimum value that we had previously? Well, the idea was that intuitively we have a larger range of boundary injection changes to consider. So if we try to consider what is the worst case in a larger range of possible boundary injection changes, what would happen is that we would have, let's say, a larger upper bound on the minimum intra-area export cost. So this means that we would ask for more money to handle the possible disaggregation risk. Of course, if we have this more money, we would face a smaller disaggregation risk because we will have asked already enough money to cover the possible congestion under, let's say, a wider and more difficult range of operating conditions. And of course, if we do this for a smaller range of boundary injection changes, we will face greater risk that in the future, let's say, when we come to deliver what the market asks us to deliver, we will not have enough money to actually dispatch and settle the congestion. But of course, we will have a lower upper bound on the intra-area minimum export cost. So by that reasoning, we thought that we can, let's say, communicate both the intra-area activation cost as well as the risk of congestion management inside the intra-area, because now we have made a direct association between our risk aversion, which is how small or big we assume this range to be, and the money that we ask from the zonal balancing market in order to deliver an incremental change in the zonal balancing position. Of course, for the second part of my presentation, I would like to explain to you how we could compute this worst-case residual supply function approximation and how we formulated a mathematical problem to give us the number that we are looking for and how we solved the corresponding mathematical problem. So very graphically, we solve a bi-level optimization problem, where at the upper level we try to maximize the operating cost of exporting the zonal flexibility, subject to a constraint that imposes that the boundary injection changes that we will face would be inside a respective plausible range. And I have, of course, a next slide on how we define this plausible range. Now, this upper level defines the boundary injection changes within the plausible range that maximize the operating cost of delivering zonal flexibility, and at the same time, at the lower level, we try to minimize the said cost. Given boundary injection changes from the upper level, we pose the problem of minimizing the operating cost of delivering zonal flexibility, subject to the nodal power balance constraint, and here is exactly where the boundary injection changes intervene, because they appear as extra balancing demand or generation at the boundary nodes. And of course, we have the zonal flexibilities, which of course mean changes in the position of the intrazonal resources. Classically, we have some constraints on the zonal resources and what they can deliver in terms of zonal flexibility. And of course, we have the intra-area power flows, which have to remain within the branch capacity limits. Now, what is interesting for sure, I guess, if you are following the presentation, is how to define this plausible range of boundary injection changes. And here we considered something simple yet easy to follow, and that is for any market zone. Of course, we have a set of nodes that have interconnectors outside the respective control areas. And of course, we may only face boundary injection changes in these nodes. And for any such node, we have a set of external boundary injection changes which go towards external nodes, different nodes of the external control area. So these are the variables that in fact we are looking for. These are the 5 variables here, denotes the boundary injection change. And what we try to do is for any given target export quantity, because remember we solve this iteratively to construct the whole curve, we have lower and upper bounds, and I will come back again in the case study on how we define the precise lower and upper bounds to put a box around the variable that we are looking for, the boundary injection change. So we impose these bounds, and of course we impose that the boundary injection changes amount to the change in the zonal position, the target export quantity that we wish to deliver to the rest of the system. This is the lower level of the problem. It's a classical DC optimal power flow where the only, let's say, notable modification is that for the boundary nodes we have these boundary flows. So in the nodal power balance, we have, of course, the change in the intrazonal resources, we have the intra-area power flows, and we have the boundary change, the change of the boundary flows wherever this is relevant. We also have some penalty terms for cases when this is infeasible, and when we have these penalty terms activated, it means that we don't submit an offer for the corresponding volume. So this is, let's say, comes in direct follow-up of the previous formulation of the DC-OPF problem that was used to compute the so-called residual supply function approximation. Now, of course, we know that bi-level problems are not very easy to solve all the time, but in this case, we have a I would say, a little bit simplified or special case of a bi-level optimization problem that comes with a very nice property. And the property is that the lower level is indeed a convex function because the lower level is convex in the boundary injection changes. So essentially what the bi-level optimization problem does, it maximizes a convex function inside a closed bounded set that is defined by the minimum and maximum plausible range of changes that we assume for any one of the boundary injection change variables. And rather than, let's say, implying big M reformulation or some tricks that take more computational time, what we could do is that we could just exhaustively evaluate the lower level problem over all the corner points of the space of plausible boundary injection changes. Now, of course, the number of corner points here depends on the number of interconnectors, meaning how many connections we have from the control area that we care about to the rest of the interconnected power system. But what we found is that typically for power grids, because we have, let's say, in the order of tens at most, this is not very prohibitively large. So we can indeed find all the corner points in the space of plausible boundary injection changes and just solve many LPs to indeed retrieve the worst case cost of the residual supply function approximation. But another problem that comes with the idea of using this worst case approximation and the bi-level formulation is that the worst case residual supply function is not convex in the target export quantity. We can explain this both mathematically, and we can also explain this by the physical, let's say, intuition on the problem that we're trying to solve. But very simply, it means that if we export more, it doesn't necessarily mean that we will always pay more, because sometimes what we do is that we try to export more with a given worst case pattern that turns out to be a little bit more favorable in terms of the congestion that we create or resolve. So we had a small problem here when we were writing the PSCC paper, because this of course means that we cannot just simply derive a marginal cost. And what we did in the PSCC paper is we added a set of logical constraints in the balancing market clearing problem to ensure that we accept the offers from the worst case residual supply function in the order that we pose them. So we only accept a cheaper bid in the right place, sometimes after a more expensive bid, if this is the nature of our curve. Note here that this is a problem that we also have seen in other types of aggregation problems, for example with batteries, or with resources that have minimum technical limits, even in case of no network. So we were interested a little bit more in that, and after the paper we worked a little bit more, and now we can develop a translation of the non-convex worst case residual supply function approximation curve into exclusive block bids that are directly integrated in the clearing of the market. Okay, we have some results to finally discuss. I don't know if I'm going super fast with this. You can let me know about it if it's possible. Is it too fast?
Difficult to go back.
I can always do this, it's okay. Anyways, I have imported two different case studies that were considered in the previous works that developed the residual supply function approximation. And in the paper we examined both of them. One is a very simple test case that we can basically reverse engineer, so we can really understand how our worst case residual supply function approximation works by looking in this very simple intuitive test case. The other one was inspired by some collaboration with the Nordic TSO, I believe, at the time. So this corresponds to, let's say, a test case where we really had the problem of intra-area congestion after the clearing of the zonal balancing market. Since I have plenty of time, by speaking too fast in the first two parts, I will take you through both of them. Now, as I said, in the Chow-Peck test case is simple enough that we can reverse engineer, and that's when it became interesting for us to examine, let's say, the shape of the curve of the worst case residual supply function approximation and what it means. And to help, let's say, our understanding of that, here we plot the merit order, meaning the cost that we would have if we were to aggregate the intrazonal resources without any network. And then we have the curve that we get if we impose the boundary injections to be within the capacity of the respective transmission branches. So we think that a very, of course, conservative, plausible range of changes for our boundary injections would be upper and lower bounded by the respective branch capacity, because, of course, you would never overload these branches. And if you were to do this, there would be some coordinated redispatch actions. And what you may observe here is the non-convexity of the curve, where, okay, when we have a deviation from the merit order to the worst case residual supply function approximation, of course, this implies congestion. The only reason why it would cost more, let's say, to deliver the intrazonal aggregation in the market, in our case with respect to the merit order, would be that we have congestion in our system. And what you notice here is that we have, let's say, different congestion patterns in this part of the curve with respect to that part of the curve that are seen by different adders. And when we look in the detailed results, and we could reverse engineer for that, we see that these correspond to alternative corner points being active. And when we have a different corner point in the space of the plausible boundary injections being activated, this creates a different, let's say, congestion pattern inside the network that we care about. So then you have to activate different resources to fix that congestion. That's why the incremental cost is different in the different points, because different corner point means different congestion inside the network. So then it means that you activate a different redispatch action, and you can see this being translated here. But of course, the let's say real interest for us would be how to realistically define the range that we are looking for, so the lower and upper bound. And what we try to do here is to, let's say, sketch different possibilities by defining the lower and upper bound for the boundary injection changes in percentage of the branch capacities from 0.25 to 100%. And of course, what we see is that if we are too narrow, it means nothing. It's like neglecting the risk that we care about, because there's no possible congestion if the boundary injection changes are very small. So basically what happens is that for the very narrow case, the worst case RSF, it touches the merit order. It's like neglecting the possibility of congestion. Of course, if you make it too wide, you become ultra conservative, because you really ask for a substantial amount of money on top of the cost of the resources, just for the possibility that a very extreme congestion pattern will realize after the clearing of the balancing market. Ideally, we would like to get it just right, so that we could recover the eventual cost of delivering the quantity that the market has asked us to activate. But since we could not evaluate that in advance, we came up with a protocol of evaluating this, let's say, by means of Monte Carlo simulation. So what we did here is, first of all, we generated about 1,000 samples of nodal imbalances. And of course, we build the worst case residual supply function, and we submit that in the zonal balancing market. Once we clear the zonal balancing market, given the worst case residual supply function for the zone of study, we try to disaggregate the quantity that the market asked us to disaggregate. And then, of course, we could evaluate, let's say, this whole idea by these three proposed metrics. First of all, we try to find what is the quantity that the balancing market asked us to activate, and we observe the average value of that. The reason why we care about the quantity is, of course, because we are adding, let's say, a risk component in the price of the resources. So the more of that we ask, the less competitive we become in the market. And it means that we don't want to ask too much money, such that the market, let's say, reduces the volume that it is asking for us, because we're taking away of the economic viability of the resources. Now, what we really care about is the disaggregation cost. So meaning the money that we have to spend when we receive the instruction from the market and we want to dispatch the resources inside our zone. And this is where we could, let's say, face a shortfall, because we have anticipated this wrongly in the start. And the third metric is the money that we have asked for the market. So here, what happens is that we build this worst case residual supply function approximation. We ask the market to pay us some money to deliver a certain balancing volume. So for the volume that we were instructed, we compare what it cost us to deliver and what we asked. Ideally, we want to ask exactly what it costs to deliver, but maybe it's better to be a little bit more extra rather than being negative. Of course, we wanted to have an alternative to compare against, and the alternative, to be fair and square, is to compare against the case where all bids from the zone are sent to the market without considering the network at all. This allows us to see whether indeed the activation of these bids would cause uneconomic congestion. Okay, to explain my graphics now, on the left you see the balancing costs for exporting cases. I have also for importing, but these are less interesting. And here in the white part, you see the money that we have asked for the market for the balancing volume that the market asked us to activate. And with the red part, for three different cases of, let's say, no grid consideration and two different values of the boundary injection ranges, you see the money that it would cost us to actually deliver the volume that the market has asked us to deliver. And what you see here, let's say, clearly is that if we don't consider the network and we just forward the resources to the market, we would face eventual congestion when we try to disaggregate. And then this would mean that, let's say, on average, the money that we would have to spend to follow the instruction that we receive from the market is less than what we asked for. We see that even for a very moderate boundary injection range, so this is plus minus 25% of the respective capacity limits, we can recover enough money in the white part of the bars to cover the disaggregation cost in the on average. It means that we are, let's say, safe. We have, let's say, protected the system from the risk that we face. Now, if we do too much, if we go more conservative, like I said, we have two effects. One is that we indeed get, let's say, much more money than what we need, but progressively this reduces the volume that we are asked by the market to deliver, because we are making an intrazonal resources more expensive than what they need to be. Now it's more interesting to look at these graphs for the test case inspired by real life and the Nordic test case, and here I have the same color coding. But what you may already have seen is that even if we keep, let's say, increasing and increasing the conservativeness, even if we keep, let's say, computing the worst case residual supply function approximation over wider ranges of plausible boundary injections, we never get it right. So we can never, let's say, even in the case of plus minus 100%, we cannot recover, we cannot ask for enough money to solve the possible problem of intra-area congestion. Of course, at first sight, this was a result with which we were not very happy, or rather we were a little bit puzzled, because it makes, let's say, this whole idea a little bit pointless, and we tried to understand why this is the case. And to try to understand why this is the case, we examined whether or not this cost is attributable to another factor, this small cost difference. And the other factor is that, let's say, apart from the external grid, we may also face imbalances inside the area that we care about. So we have a snapshot, a single forecast for what will happen in our grid, but of course, in the same way that we have external imbalances, we may have unforeseen imbalances in the internal grid. And to control for that factor, we repeated the simulation without imbalance realizations in the area of interest. So what you see here is that if we could perfectly forecast what would happen, let's say, in terms of the generation and load inside our own area, and try to offer, let's say, the resources without caring for the grid, we would still face, let's say, a financial risk problem, a problem of disaggregation cost risk. But in that case, even with a very moderate, let's say, consideration of the boundary injection change risk, we could recover enough money. So even if, let's say, we cannot hedge, which by design is natural because we only try to design a risk measure to protect us for the external work, let's say in case of perfect foresight in the internal system, we could correctively hedge against the risk of the disaggregation cost due to the fact that our grid is interconnected with external and unobservable control areas. Okay, so what was the context of my talk? My context was flexibility resource aggregation for zonal balancing market, and our proposal was to evaluate the worst case intra-area congestion cost over a so-called plausible range of interconnection power flow changes. And the whole motivation for this was to try to communicate with the market not only the cost of the resources, not only the cost of the grid constraints, but also the cost of the TSO risk aversion, because in reality we cannot really forecast everything in advance, and TSOs tend to be risk averse in a hidden way by filtering bids and so on and so forth. We found that if, let's say, we were given a suitable range of boundary injection changes, we could correctly hedge against the risk that we care about. But of course, we found that, let's say, defining this suitable range is not very trivial. So the next thing that we would think about would be to use historical data where we have indeed observations of how the system behaves and how we exchange balancing demand between control areas and market zones to define the range of plausible injection changes from historical data. And of course, what we only discovered when we examined our results is that we also need to account for intra-area uncertainties, because this really shifts away the system from the point where we expect it to operate to the point where it is actually asked to deliver balancing power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Efthymis. Any questions for our speaker?
It was either super clear or super unclear.
Maybe yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Thank you for the nice talk. Yeah, the first kind of the obvious question is, what is the computational limit that you can go?
Well, what is your computer? Is the
computational limit you can go for, you think? Because it's a nonlinear problem anyway, and then I think by generating all these extreme points, there should be, it's quite burdensome for a large scale problem. So
okay, so you don't have to generate all of them at the same time, and then you can parallelize the LPs, right? I think your question is very well taken, but okay, it also depends on which one is your computer. Now, if you ask me how to do this in practice, I think in practice you will find that there are, let's say, some patterns that can be by default excluded by consideration, because they are, of course, corner points in my space, but let's say never really happen.
Okay, and the second question is, I think because of this risk aversion factor that is included in this worst case cost thing, or what I can imagine is the resulting cleared power cannot be, maybe can, but cannot be correspond to the, for example, the optimal nodal results. Did you compare with this kind of welfare difference between this one with the nodal cases, for example?
So you're thinking about a nodal case with perfect foresight, I guess. Huh?
Yeah. I mean, perfect foresight. Here, the reason why, when you don't care about imbalances, at least in nodal system, you don't need to care about the, those kind of the other interaction between other zones, So in that case, it's also fair to think, okay, nodal case with a perfect foresight with the comparison. So I'm wondering what is the welfare loss by considering this kind of risk aversion and considering the worst case scenarios in order to communicate with the market participants.
Yeah, obviously I have not computed that, but okay. Now I got a similar question, not exactly the same, last week, and my answer to that is that so far we have the zonal market, so we have to find a way to make it work. So it would make sense to make a theoretical comparison with, let's say, a nodal scheme, but step one would be to convince you that in the zonal market, this is the best way to work, which was, let's say, the point of my.
I agree with that, but just I was curious.
Otherwise, I agree. I'm not questioning the system immediately because I want to find out or convince you whether this is the right way to behave in a zonal market setting. I'm not super convinced myself for another reason, which we didn't really discuss, but we discovered a little bit, which is the fact that, okay, we can have these boxes, but then this neglects the correlations, which are, they come from the market, right? There are patterns that happen, like I told you in the previous answer, and patterns that don't. That's why I think it becomes a little bit more interesting to look in the historical data on how these patterns happen, and then you find out where you look to find, let's say, what is the. But still, okay, this gives you a way of approaching the problem.
Thank you.
Also subject to the power flows being linear and all this kind of stuff that we know that are just an approximation of real life. Right?
Maybe I will, if he is following us online, involuntarily drag Alberto into the conversation to ask if this all started from a project with StatNet on hierarchical balancing, and I think finally they went for bit filtering. And I'm not even sure about the status of their integration with Mari, but in case Alberto is hearing us, do we know what is the status with, has there been a follow-up on this concept of hierarchical balance? I know we're doing some work with StatNet on hierarchical T&D coordination, but is there any developments with the balancing market, or did they finally go with bit filtering?
And hi, Anthony. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you. You can turn on the video also if you want.
Yes. So, hi, everyone. Indeed, so as far as I'm aware, the concept of bit filtering is moving forward because that is a real constraint for the Norwegian TSO. In fact, some of the current integrations inside of the Nordic balancing model imply that Norway is not part of them. So it's usually a trilateral work between Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, because Norway still has a lot of issues to send all the offers for the Nordic balancing platforms, which are a pre-step of the European balancing platforms. And they basically do not join at this moment the Nordic ones, because activations that can come from these markets can cause internal congestions inside of the 5 Norwegian zones. And the proposed approach, at least in the short term, is indeed going to bit filtering. Hierarchical balancing, I think, is still considered as an interesting concept, as a research, and can be implemented in the future. But at least as of now, there is a dedicated team at the StatNet working towards making sure that the bit filtering approach is the one that is possible, because also this is allowed by the European legislation. The system operation guidelines particularly specifies that you are allowed as a TSO to filter out bits if they will represent any risk to your system. Whereas hierarchical balancing can be seen as a manipulation or in some sense a modification of the market. So it's not clear how these interactions how this will change in the future. So the current status is bit filtering is moving forward, but it still is not fully developed, but it's expected to be used for sure when StatNet joins first the Nordic balancing platforms and then eventually the European ones.
Great, thanks Alberto, very informative, and maybe to also do some advertisement on some ongoing work of Themis with Stella from IPTO on testing bit filtering.
Yeah, we're also doing an MSc project now on bit filtering methodologies, but maybe in the next ICEBERG event we will have more to say about that. Stella is not even here, I think. So obviously, she's at work.
All right. Any
Hopefully.
further? Maybe in the beach. Any further questions? Great. Okay, we are 4 minutes ahead of time, so we do have lunch in this conference, apparently. That was my mistake yesterday. Outside to the left, we are back at 1:30, and don't make sure to be in the last plenary. Psychis is talking, Professor Magliopoulos from Georgia Tech is talking in the last plenary. And we have also a very interesting session on electricity market design, which I think, even though it's the end of the conference and the end of the week, I think it's still worth you attending the last bit. See you.